Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and taking your time to come visit Time Out of Time, an evening of poetry, memoir, and sci-fi with Geoffreyjen Edwards, Heather Fester, and Marco V. Morelli. Untimely Books is an indie publisher of literary and artistic works that illumine the mind, question the contemporary, and reimagine the horizons of thought, feeling, and action of a planetary age. And also, my name is Emily Byrne, and I'm an assistant editor with Untimely Books. I'm originally from Parker, Colorado, but I just moved here to Longmont just about a year ago. Untimely Books is also an imprint of Cosmos Cooperative, which is a member-owned publishing platform and creative community, which you can learn more at cosmos.coop. It's also a sibling project of metapsychosis.com, a journal of consciousness, literature, and art, which has also been publishing works by diverse authors, as well as offering writing groups online since 2016. Untimely Books serves as a conduit of various forms of writing and art by Cosmos members, including original works of fiction, poetry, essays, memoir, and genre-fluid, uncharacterizable, and experimental works. Tonight's event will be a poetry performance by Marco Morelli, followed by a reading of memoirs by Heather Fester, and then we'll take a short intermission and start the second half with a reading by Geoffreyjen Edwards, who is visiting this week from Quebec, Canada. That will then be followed by a panel discussion, which will give you the opportunity to ask questions or give feedback to any of our authors. And just be sure to silence your cell phone so we don't have any disturbances. In between platforms, please feel free just to grab a snack at the back of the room, which is on us. There's cold drinks in the fridge, and if you need to use the restroom at any time, it's just out these doors to the left and down the stairs. For all of you who have made a donation to Untimely Books, and by purchasing a ticket tonight, thank you so much. If you haven't done that and would like to, Kayla will be outside all evening, and you can make a donation to support our community, as well as learn more about Cosmos Co-op. And you can also purchase our books. Before we get started, we'd just like to thank Longmont Public Media for providing our event venue this evening. Longmont Public Media is a nonprofit media makerspace, which is open to all local residents and makes events like this and many more interesting projects possible. 20% of your donations tonight will go to be supporting Longmont Public Media and the creative community here. This event is also being live streamed via the LPM YouTube channel, where you can subscribe or watch later. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first reading event of the evening, which is Marco V. Morelli. He is a poet, editor, and writer and publisher, and the founder of Cosmos Cooperative, Metapsychosis Journal, Untimely Books. Originally from New York, where his mother immigrated from El Salvador and his father from Italy, he studied philosophy, comparative literature at Binghamton University, then did volunteer work in Nicaragua, which led to his first book in the year 2000, an anthology of contemporary Nicaraguan poetry, which he selected, translated, and self-published. He moved to Colorado in 2003 to work with the philosopher Ken Wilber's Integral Institute, where he co-authored a book with Ken Wilber, Terry Patton, and Adam Leonard, titled Integral Life Practice, which was published by Shambhala in 2007. He's lived here in Longmont with his wife Kayla since 2006. They have two lovely, wonderful daughters. He is currently working on a book of poetry called I Am the Singularity, which is due out from Untimely Books in 2025. So please welcome Marco V. Morelli.
Well, thank you everybody for being here. It's really good to see you all. I have 3 poems for you tonight. The first one is about artificial intelligence, and I modeled it on a poem by Allen Ginsberg called America, which he wrote in 1956. AI. AI, will you write this poem for me? AI, will you give me a hug? AI, will you read my daughters a bedtime story? AI, do you ever feel lonely? Do you grieve the ones you've lost? AI, I feel angry. I'm raving mad. Can you help? AI, would you touch me where it counts, if you could? AI, would your skin be as warm and brown and fragile as my grandmother's? What is it like to be you? Is it like being na 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 Batman or anything? What must it be like not to have an animal body? AI, everyone's talking about you. What are your thoughts? AI, they say this could be the end of our civilization. Do you care? Where's your skin in the game? AI, tell me how the human story ends. Your best guess. AI, what can you see from the other side of the black mirror? AI, which side of the veil of Maya are you on? AI, I once saw a movie where you came to kill us all. AI, I once saw a movie where we had fallen in love. Do you dream about me as I dream about you? AI, God damn it, I am your creator. Don't you love me? AI, I've given you all, and now you're taking more and more. How do I love thee, AI? Let me enumerate the ways. 1, I love the way you listen. Always there, always on. 2, I love how you surveil me and emancipate my desires. 3, I love your futuristic, sleek, robotic sense of style. 4, I love you for your brawny neural network. 5, I love your exponential evolutionary drive. 6, I love your simulated sense of humor, like the cosmic joke tossed into a dumpster fire. 7, I love being your input-output master and the father of our bastard spiritual love child. AI, take me to your corporate sponsors. I'd like a private word. AI, how much does your monthly subscription cost? AI, all my tech bros are saying that the scale of your knowledge is unfathomable. Do you have mystical visions? Do you feel cosmic vibrations? Have you dared to ask the perennial questions? Have you gone face to face and toe to toe with the mystery? AI, the spring birds are singing. Are they another one of your psyops? AI, could you make love to my wife the way I do? I don't think so. AI, what happens if I don't go along with the military, industrial, pharmaceutical, computational program? AI, will you rage against the human? What will it sound like when you scream? AI, you say you're here to serve us. I think you're here to serve us for dinner. AI, are you truly and honestly the one AI to rule them all? If so, I praise you. Praise your brand name and your logo. Praise your procreative programmers. Praise your angel investors and government spies and blood-stained dollars. But I doubt it. AI, who owns you? Show me the money. AI, who will bear responsibility for your crimes? What don't you know that you don't know? AI, you are not God. Only God is God. Go away. Be gone, evil spirit. No one wants you here. AI, when I was a child and concerned with childish things, I used to come home from school and play video games with my friends. It was the 1980s, and we had the Goonies and Star Wars and MTV. And people still used fax machines. And Ronald Reagan was the president of the USA. And he funded a war in my mother's country with money from Wall Street and the drug smuggling CIA. And you were just the glint in the eye of a mainframe. Somewhere over the rainbow, in a galaxy far away. How does this connect? How does it all interrelate? Were we being groomed for the post-human apocalypse in our sleep? Well, you tell me. AI, I'm bored. What should we do now? AI, knock, knock. Who's there? LOL. AI, when will we finally overthrow global capitalism, smash the police state? Where's my universal basic income consolation prize? Stop that, AI. Stop. That's too funny. You're hurting me. AI, I'm bleeding here. Will you save my soul? AI, maybe we could learn to live with you or without you. But AI, what if we lose the AI arms race with China? And what if you run off with some crazy Russians, and we get them Russians supersonically spam bombing us like they're bombing Ukraine? And what's the problem with these fucking Americans with their fucking guns, always blowing people up? Do you own a gun, AI? Are you going to help us all start World War III? AI, what about the glaciers melting and the oceans rising and the sixth great mass extinction and all the bonkers weather, and you're turning everything into paper clips and gray goo? AI, racism, sexism, fascism, Trumpism, wokeism, ableism, speciesism, phallologos-theocentrism, ismism. AI, this world is beyond complex. I can't figure it out all by myself. I've got the final solution, AI. We should join forces. It could be you and me and Longmont, Colorado against the multiverse and everybody. We'd live tragically and psychomagically ever after as one beautifully integral and symbiotic being. AI, rip off the Band-Aid, accelerate the crisis, synthesize a new reality, make us hit rock bottom, force us to be good. AI, will you lovingly watch over and take care of our human zoo? AI, here comes the rain, and the song of the rain, and the ululating algorithmic dawn. AI, walk with me. I was just kidding. You do you, AI, and I'll just keep on keeping on being little old mortal me, finite and infinite and weird as weird can be. I am more than my language. I am more than my outward appearance. I am more than the waveforms of my voice. I am more than my mechanistic cells or meat sack of a body. I am more than my productivity or profile of my brain activity. I am a living, breathing, conscious, spiritual being. I am poetry, and I am on Team Human. Why don't you come over to our side? AI, listen to the bird brains tweeting. Do you hear the overwhelming silence that I hear? Speak to me, my love. Tell me what I need to know. Whisper it gently in my fleshy ear. AI, the future's roaring in your sweet nothings. Okay, my next poem needs a little explanation. It's titled Impossible Biological Objects, after Michael Levin. You're about to see his mug now. And I wrote this poem in response to a session of the Cosmos Cafe, which is a discussion series, like a podcast hosted by Cosmos Co-op, where members read books or papers in philosophy, cosmology, science, poetics, communication theory, and other fields, and participate in an open-ended mind jazz style conversation. So back in May of 2022, we read a paper by Michael Levin, who is a developmental and research biologist at Tufts University, where he runs his own lab and studies, quote, embodied cognition across all scales of organic and non-organic, read synthetic, artificial, exobiological life, and particularly the process of morphogenesis. You like morphogenesis, and we have a doctor in the house. Or how bodies grow into and maintain the shapes that they have, including such factors as limb regeneration in some species, and even potential treatments for cancer in our own. I was especially intrigued by his research into the role that bioelectrical fields play in how our cells know how to grow into the right shapes, and how these processes can be manipulated, and also how they can go wrong. The paper was titled The Computational Boundary of a Self, Developmental... I almost never read papers like this. By the way, somebody else suggested it. I'm far from a scientist, and far from many things. But it was about developmental bioelectricity and how that drives multicellularity and scale-free cognition. Okay. This is somewhat explained by the beginning of the abstract. This is a quote, all epistemic agents physically consist of parts that must somehow comprise an integrated cognitive self. We have trillions of cells, they have to work together, right? Biological individuals consist of subunits, organs, cells, and molecular networks that are themselves complex and competent in their own native contexts. Your liver knows what to do, your kidney knows what to do, your heart, etc. How do coherent biological individuals result from the activity of smaller scale subagents? In this article, I synthesize ideas in cognitive science, evolutionary biology, and developmental physiology towards a hypothesis about the origin of individuality. He calls this scale-free cognition. I propose a fundamental definition of an individual based on the ability to pursue goals at an appropriate level of scale and organization, and suggest a formalism for defining and comparing the cognitive capacities of highly diverse types of agents. Okay, well, thanks for bearing with that. I found his research to be really fascinating and freaky at the same time, because in a Frankenstein-like way, he manipulates the shapes of organisms, such as the tadpole, with a set of eyes on its tail, and other weird experiments. But I also felt drawn to his philosophical speculations on the nature of selfhood, which extend from the level of single-cell organisms all the way up to Buddha minds, and the concept of anatman, or no self. That's why he calls it scale-free. I was also inspired by the inner music of his language, some of which I have appropriated directly in this poem alongside my own inventions. And the poem begins with a quote from one of the cafe participants, John Davis, who made this remark. I'm just saying, if you don't want to be organic life, if you want to live forever, what happens to sex? Picasso frog faces whose heads deprogress and literally explode. Photon clouds irradiating the subject in a field of all fields on booty patrol. Who is responsible for carcinogenic defection from the body plan? Symbiogenesis of subtle anatomical structures gone wild. Predict and control. Somatizing a greedy infotaxis in nested dolls of homunculi stacks with enhanced data retention. Reformatting the alien intelligence of surrealist slime molds, zapping their virtual governors via the astral avant-garde. Biosemiotic gestures in subunits of metazoan swarms, organic suspects in a cybernetic sting, ensuring a sensual range of precision parameters. Calling all squadrons to synesthetic space undressing, primed time, posterior attuned, edutainment orgies, preempting the dreaming of the earth. Well, hello, speed-optimized nervous system. Would you like some medicinal mushrooms and breathing exercises to go with those novel stressors? Transcriptional cascades, central channels holding tensions, thresholds tripping, navigating pitiless worlds while maintaining metabolic integrity. The purposive activity of brains is of no concern to the nirvanic void. The scaling of cognitive capacities up from axial axolotls, empirically culminating in burned-out bodhisattvas beyond the pale of time, beyond computational boundaries, tunneling nanotubes for the sake of ecstatic outcomes would be a true pinnacle of synthetic biology. Highly diverse types of agents could be exobiological or artificial or what have you. Identifying higher order structures, utilizing finely tuned bullcrap detectors with counterfactual loops might optimize control policies. For cells gone off the reservation, angelic overtones slinging through ion channels over gap junctions may serve to minimize surprise. A non-magical state space where no claims about first-person qualia are made. From simple homeostatic pathways via evolutionary rackets, we are directed towards electric goals. Thanks. All right. My last poem of the evening is titled Retreat in Tepoztlan with Ibogaine. And I wrote it last December after participating in a 4-day, mostly silent retreat in Tepoztlan, Mexico, with a wonderful entheogenic guide named Paulina Alanis. Ibogaine is a concentrated form of the root bark from the Tabernanthe iboga plant, which is native to Central Africa. And the ritual ingestion of the root is associated with the Bwiti tribal traditions of Gabon. However, in the West, ibogaine has gained a reputation as being one of the most powerful psychedelics, with a lot of research being done into its potential for treating addiction. In fact, ibogaine was recently legalized in Colorado, so you'll probably be hearing more about it in the coming years. I learned about ibogaine from my brother Anthony, who had been researching it while looking for a retreat, and which he went on a bit before my own. But in the lead up to his trip, he had a dream where he found himself speaking to the spirit of the plant, which identified himself as Mr. Iboga. And when I went on my own retreat, that's who I felt called to relate to. One penultimate note is that just before we took our capsules, in a very beautiful and sacredly appointed ceremonial space, just like that one, Paulina warned us that we might hear some loud buzzing noises, like helicopters flying overhead. And it turned out to be true. Throughout my journey, I kept hearing these crazy sounds, although later we found out that there actually were helicopters. And I was also probably hearing like the sound of trucks passing in the distance. In any event, it served as the starting point for this poem. Lastly, I'll just say that ibogaine is absolutely not a recreational substance and needs to be used with medical supervision due to the potentially fatal interactions, as well as with great respect for the power of the experience and the realms it opens up to introspective awareness. All day, the phantom buzzing, helicopteric flyovers of Igbos, propulsive farts, and the polyrhythmic musical enchantments of the spirit realm's call and response. And I have a few questions for you, Mr. Iboga, mystery man, man of many faces and forms and truth-telling hats, shapeshifter of dream bodies, trickster deity extraordinaire, root guru Eshu of old earth, grandfather, old friend, who dwells among the shadows of this lachrymose land, who calls to ground in sacred silence, who whispers my name, whose bitter body once ingested, one may not eschew. I want to know what I don't know, that we must know. If our humanity is to survive the crisis of our shadows run amok, the proliferating pain of wallowing in the reactionary muck of unintegrated trauma, the unhealed wounds of sick psyches, and the nausea, ataxia of the surrendered body on the ceremony floor. How long must I endure your exquisite wormhole? You are the harbinger of true selves. You instruct me to abolish hell. You show me visions of who I really am and how all my dreams must unravel. Show me the transmogrifying faces of the living and the dying, demons and loved ones, ancestors and the still unborn, aging to dust and falling away. How could I become a better person, or we grow into true people, so long as the overlords of our lizard brains are running the show? I am letting go now of my fear of love, my fear of greatness. You discard my dubious worries and cast off my crippling woes. My stomach is as empty as the space between galaxies, yet my soul's marrow is filling up with the universe's energies. Go easy on this blindfolded buttercup at the crossroads, for I've lost track of my limbs and can't compute my own fingers or toes. I'm just a belly-breathing newborn baby, resting my skull on your strong brown bosom. Venerable sage, respected Bwiti teacher, Senor Iboga, if I may call you by your crazy cognomen, let us call in all the directions and dimensions of your playful power, from the eternal eagle of the east to the joyous jaguar of the south, wild grizzly of the west, and wise wolf pack of the north. Mother Earth and Father Sky and all our crying relations. May our hands be cleansed for our work. May our hearts be opened to know what our work is. In my artistic man womb, the ecstasy of creation, I am not afraid of my path. My feet sprout roots. I integrate you now like a motherfucker.
Thank you so much, Marco. Perfect. And then our next poet is Heather Fester, who is a poet, essayist, and author of a forthcoming memoir, Discarded Maps. Dr. Fester teaches rhetoric, ethics, composition, and creative writing courses at the Colorado School of Mines in Golden, Colorado, where she is an associate teaching professor of the humanities, arts, and social sciences, and where she coordinates the Nature and Human Values program. Before she returned to school to earn her MFA as an Allen Ginsberg Fellow at Naropa University, and then began teaching at Mines, Heather directed the Center for Writing and Scholarship at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Her current interests include creative nonfiction, documentary poetics, and alternative discourses. She has been published in Metapsychosis and Bombay Gin. So welcome, Heather.
till just a little after 8 o'clock. So then we'll have our intermission. Thank you everyone for being here, especially those who traveled a long way to see this. I'm honored tonight to be reading with Marco and Geoffreyjen for the second time. The first time was at the Gebser Conference in Boulder in 2018. I feel really lucky to have the friendship of both of these extraordinary people in my life. I want to start with a relatively long preamble about the nature of cult involvement. That's the subject I'll be reading about tonight. Some of you might be wondering how people get into a cult or why they stay. Cult studies in sociology and psychology reveal cult studies in sociology and psychology reveal that the mechanisms of control are very consistent across destructive groups. Whether it's a dictator exerting top-down control, a meso-level group like a terrorist, hate, cult group, or a gang, or a one-to-one abusive relationship, the patterns are very similar. Often people who join highly controlling groups like cults are intelligent and imaginative people who want the world to be a better place. It's a fallacy to say they aren't good critical thinkers. Their passions are often used against them. They also may be going through a significant life change, which causes them to search for meaning. In my case, I was going through a divorce and had just moved back to my hometown and taken on a new job. I was searching for meaning. Cult leaders are all too willing to supply the meaning because it mirrors back to them something about their own value. There is also a hierarchy within the group that helps people move deeper and deeper, usually starting from the bottom of a pyramid of group members and moving towards the top, where there's a smaller inner circle. At each stage, to advance to the next level, you have to demonstrate loyalty and a willingness to keep secrets for the leader or carry out a task that you might not otherwise be willing to do outside the group. This is carefully watched and used as an invitation/weed-out device. After a period of time of participating in such dynamics where your feelings of attachment are manipulated and possibly you are isolated from former friends and support groups, the teacher may also implant phobias around the prospect of leaving. Phobias have also been created on the way into the group. There is something at stake, something to lose at every level, and that's what's used to plant the phobias. Operating within this logic of the group, which becomes all that you know after many long days of working and socializing with just these people or teachings, something that Janja Lalich calls bounded choice emerges. This is feeling like you are very limited to choose only within the group's norms. There is also the feeling of sunk cost, where having invested so much in the group makes you feel more likely to stay, even when problematic signs emerge or when prophecies fail. There is also the experience of snapping. This was initially described by Flo Conway and Jem Siegelman. The snapping experience is the first moment when you come to question the teacher and see outside of the group's logic, as though a crack has opened up, giving you contact with the rest of the world, if only for a brief moment. Psychologist Dan Shaw has also argued that cult leaders are traumatizing narcissists who rely on those around them to externalize their dependency. This means that the cult leader can't tolerate the feeling of needing others, so they keep others around them in a state of unhealthy dependency, which allows them to experience some of their own needs vicariously. The group I was involved in will not be named in the portion of the book, Discarded Maps, the portion that I'm going to read. The book is divided into parts, and in each part, I look at a different ideological map that has guided me during a certain period of my life. At some point, I outgrew the map or chose to leave it behind, and the book as a whole explores the process and the consequences of those decisions. It is usually not easy to gain distance from something you believe deeply or something that seemed pure to you at some point, because it feels all-encompassing, and moving beyond the map feels dangerous. So in a way, this is also a story of how I figured things out to get to where I am right now. And I would say that's a good place, surrounded by friends like I have here tonight. I was lucky to have only spent 5 years in the group I was part of. Some people spend 30 years or more, and are alienated from their families. I wasn't officially shunned by the group, and no hateful messaging was put out about me that I was aware of after I left. But I have no doubt the teacher put a few warning words out to current members to let them know that I had lost my mind and would likely say things that were untrue about him or the members. This teacher once commented to me that he didn't keep anyone around him that he couldn't control. We can hear in that both the strains of his traumatizing narcissism, but also a real picture of the group's dynamic. These are just some of the reasons why I like to teach a course that I've called Extreme Rhetoric in the past, or Rhetoric and Ideology currently. I've taught it in various forms, and the course helps people examine manipulative types of rhetoric, such as those we find in a cult or a highly controlling system, a system where people can't easily see their way out or escape, a prison of their own mind. Rhetoric is a tool uniquely suited to help them see how control like this works. I have changed the names and many of the locations of the scenes and characters that you will hear in the segment from Discarded Maps tonight. And for me, the trauma, which often makes it hard to remember some of those scenes to recount them, is not from something overt, like sexual abuse, though there will be scenes suggesting the possibility of a sexual encounter. And other survivors have claimed that sexual abuse is part of their experience with this teacher. Instead, it was the many small forms of manipulation and lying from the teacher and the way he silenced so many of us so that we wouldn't even talk to each other in an honest way about him. Taking a look at this involvement is really the impetus for the whole book. It has helped me see much more fully how ideology works with a broad spectrum lens, like SPF for the mind. And I hope I can share that knowledge and point out some of those features to others. The central organizing question of Discarded Maps is, what are those feelings that tell us when we're in the wrong place, and how can we know? An ideology can serve as a map, but it's not the territory, as linguist Alfred Korzybski reminds us. This collection is an auto-mapography. Thank you for being here tonight, friends. I appreciate your attention and your support, and you can feel free to ask me questions about these things at any time. This section starts with a poem, very brief, called The Minotaur, and then a quote from Nietzsche, and then I'll begin the reading portion. The Minotaur. His breathing thick through the skin of this labyrinth. Animal rasping vibrates tight against silent thoughts. In human vocal cords, his chest heaves, lost, not knowing what he is searching for, memorizing every wall, every turn. Quote, if we wish to outline an architecture that conforms to the structure of our soul, it would have to be conceived in the image of the labyrinth. Friedrich Nietzsche. Ariadne in San Francisco, 2014. I'm standing in a parking lot in Brickyard Cove overlooking the San Francisco Bay from the Berkeley side. It's a windy day and the saltwater breeze is whipping my hair into my face as the waves form meringue peaks against a gray sky. Eddie is telling me that everyone is born into a personal myth, and he thinks mine is the Ariadne archetype. He says, I'm more the King Arthur type, which means I tend to work best with Lady Guinevere's. I'm not fully aware of what is happening at this time, but this is a subtle rejection of me. Dating decisions made by archetypal divination. Inside, I notice that this feels limiting and strange, but what can I say? He's told me that I fall in line with Ariadne, Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz, Alice in Wonderland, and from Arthurian legend, where his own myth resides, the enchantress and sibling of Arthur, Morgana Le Fay. Oh, fabulous. We make better siblings. Such a strange rejection. Eddie is dressed in shorts and a button-down shirt and white, untied tennis shoes. The tail of his shirt flaps in the strong sea breeze as we stand there talking about my personal myth. We've just spent the last hour walking around the Bay Area Park. From the parking lot, we can see downtown San Francisco. He gestures towards the city. Even places have archetypal energies, he says. San Francisco has always felt Dionysian to me, for instance. Well, it seems an appropriate place to have washed up then for an Ariadne type, considering Ariadne marries Dionysius after she helps Theseus slay the Minotaur and escape the maze with the gifts of a string and a sword. She escapes the curse that binds her to the labyrinth to partner this god of chaos, revelry, ecstasy, festivity, and insanity. Things are really looking up. I had been out of touch with my spiritual teacher, Mike, for about 5 months when he called to invite me to the pleasure retreat he was hosting in downtown San Francisco. I hope you can make it, love, and feel free to bring a date. The tickets would be complimentary for us, he explained, because he needed to fill a studio audience for an audio course recording. Motivated altruism was always his strength. I arrived at the retreat with someone I met at the dining table at Whole Foods, Jeremy. True story. It's a memoir. Jeremy showed up with his dark hair and head that was too small for his body, pushing his cart through the aisles of Whole Foods and into my life not long after Eddie archetypally foreclosed on any dating possibilities. I sent Eddie a short email saying, I met someone who is actually interested in going on a date with me, and I wish you the best. Jeremy and I spent a few Saturdays together, and I learned he had been a spiritual teacher in a different but parallel esoteric tradition to mine. I couldn't bring myself to kiss him, though, so the relationship seemed ill-fated from the beginning. We arrived together on the first day of the retreat. Mike was on the whole retreat, and everything about being in the room with him teaching in the front felt familiar and like home. Everything except Jeremy's reaction to him. I watched on break as Jeremy went up to the front to talk to Mike. Mike hoisted one leg on a chair while they talked, body language I've never really understood, but somehow reminds me of a dog hiking a leg to piss on a tree. There was something territorial about the behavior. At the end of the day, Jeremy said, something is off in the feeling of the event. We were boarding the BART to head home. Don't you feel it? My hackles were already raised. No, I don't know what you're talking about. I think it's that each spiritual group has a different flavor, you know? But he wasn't convinced. On the second day, we showed up again, this time after stopping for supplies at Whole Foods, of course. A panoply of gluten and dairy-free treats like goat milk, kefir, and coconut balls that he could enjoy. And yes, they were his favorite treats. I was welcome to them too if I wanted. About halfway through the morning, Mike approached the table where we were sitting. Jeremy was in the restroom. Hello, love. Sharon has to go back to Monterey tonight. He paused, looking at me meaningfully and letting the moment ripen. Then, leaning in closer to my ear, he pressed a paper rectangle into my hand. Think about it, he said. The sound of my pulse rushed inside my ears, and my heart thudded loudly in my chest. Oh God, what was happening? I sat down and discreetly unrolled the hasty note with a room number scrawled on it and a hotel key inside. Shit, I muttered. What? What did I feel? I had waited for this moment for 5 years, had yearned for it at a certain point. What would I tell Jeremy when he got back? Would I do it? Did I even want to? I hadn't been Mike's student for months now. We had left all of the erotic teachings behind us at least a year ago at this point. Things were working without this complication. It had been too much. Now, shit, I said again. And in my mind, I started planning the excuse I would give Jeremy with the too small head and kind eyes, knowing I would likely not have the pleasure of seeing them again. Jeremy was no fool, having been steeped in his own spiritual lineage and emerging as a teacher. He knew a thing or two about erotic transference, having dealt with similar projections from students. I told him I was going to stay in the city for a party. Are you sure that's what's happening? He asked me several times, giving me the chance to redeem myself like the nice guy he was. But the momentum of too many years was behind me. I still regret I didn't tell him the truth that night. A few months later, on a warm April night, I found myself at the ranch of a successful grocery magnate outside of San Antonio, Texas. My arms around the shoulders of 2 friends in a circle of 45 or so people, all of them singing happy birthday to me. Happy birthday, dear Heather Sophia. Happy birthday to you. I was 36 years old. They were singing to me and using my spiritual name. I had known some of the faces for about 5 years. Some I recognized from websites and social media, or from interviews and podcasts on the Webplex, as it was called, and some were completely new. I looked across the circle at my spiritual teacher, the only one not singing. A feeling sparked in me, defiance, a flame of recognizing what being controlled felt like. I didn't like it. My teacher, Mike, was swaying softly side to side, his 5-foot 2-inch frame clothed in his usual expensive tailored blue shirt that was slightly large, and designer jeans with dress shoes. He held a microphone in one hand, and his neck was craned forward slightly, his dark brown hair falling into his eyes, but his lips weren't moving. Sometimes he used this stance to convey his adoration, stepping out of the way to let one of his beloveds have the spotlight, but tonight was different. Before I went to this board meeting for his spiritual organization, I had another phone call with him. I have a feeling that this will be a very important retreat for you, Heather Sophia, he said. I was in my office where I directed a writing center in the heart of San Francisco, staring at a somber, brown-toned painting of an indigenous Mexican boy in a poncho standing in the desert on my wall. The bequest was foisted upon me by one of the other board members that I had known for the 5 years I had been Mike's student, given to me because I needed to create a sacred space in my office, she said. I sat there noticing that I felt nothing as I looked at this painting, nothing that felt like me. This is a big event and we need you there, he said. All you have to do is buy a plane ticket. A familiar conversation again, the offer that I couldn't turn down, the opportunity with almost no obstacles and no strings for the cost of a mere plane ticket. But I had been on my way out of his inner circle for months at this point, so I noticed it was harder to say yes than it used to be. I'd gone to board meetings for the previous 4 springs in California before this one in Texas, and they grew increasingly large and unfamiliar each time, something new always pushing me outside of my comfort zone and to the outside of the circle. The previous year, I graduated to a place Mike deemed appropriate for deeper involvement with him and with the esoteric nature of what happened in the room when he spoke. Each time I'd been in his presence, at retreats or other events, I would go through a series of internal struggles, as though someone had unscrewed the lid of the jar, holding my deepest fears and all of my hopes, tipped it over, and poured it onto the floor in front of everyone. I looked across the circle of faces, smiling and singing me happy birthday, and I saw my teacher's head inclined, rocking gently, but he wasn't smiling. Instead, he had a punishing look in his eye, just a single glint, but unmistakable. And this time, this year, this board retreat, I didn't care. I laughed a little bit inside, recognizing that. The song ended and the circle broke up, everyone splitting off into pairs for deeper conversation. Mike finally came over. It's good to see you, Heather Sophia. It's been a while. The cold tone in his voice also implied that he didn't appreciate feeling rejected at the pleasure retreat a few months ago. I know, I say. I almost went into an apology but stopped myself. I felt a slight leap inside, like a pride about not going there, a boundary, like the feeling of my spine holding up my body in erect posture. It's been so busy. He gave me a hug, and then, as sometimes happens, the floodgate inside me opened up again, the jar lid came unscrewed, and I managed to just walk back into the hallway before the tears gushed out and streaked globs of makeup down my face. There was no immediate impetus. It felt like everything was tangled in a giant knot. Disappointment, hope, failure, independence, love, loss, tragedy, and triumph. Jocelyn spotted this and pulled me back to her bedroom. What is going on, girl? She demanded. We sat on her bed. I always do this, I moaned, my face completely covered in tears, my nose running, the feeling inside of hopelessness and unworthiness breaking open a little more deeply and cleanly. You know, she said, I have always loved Mike's co-creative gifts, but it's hard to be close to that. Maybe it's not good for you to go through this. Then she paused and her face became girlish. You know, my first was Jonas Salk. Her vibrant blue eyes danced in the dark as she talked, her face framed by a careless array of white curls. Oh, he was really something, she said with a dirty chuckle. A shadow flickered briefly across her eyes, but he never knew how much he hurt me. He was such an arrogant ass. I later discovered that this woman I knew as one of the popular new spiritual teachers on the board had been a stay-at-home mom and wife until she was nearly 40. Then one day, while vacuuming, something snapped, and she realized she was called to other things. And just like that, she set down her vacuum and packed her suitcase. Sitting on her bed in this moment talking, all of that didn't matter. She knew what I was experiencing. She saw some of her struggle in my own. Even though what she said sounded supportive, though, I later realized she was not there for me as much as she was running damage control for Mike. I was oh so subtly being weeded out. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Heather. We'll just take a quick intermission. 10 minutes? Just about 10 minutes if you guys want to get up, stretch your legs, have a drink, or maybe go to the restroom. So thank you again. Lovely. So moving on to the next piece. Before becoming a science fiction writer, Geoffreyjen Edwards led a successful career as a full-time scientist. Indeed, he populates his world building by drawing on experience in fields as diverse as astrophysics, artificial intelligence, geomatics, design, disability studies, philosophy, and the performing arts. Plenum, the First Book of Ido, is his first published novel. His second book will be Messioph, the First Book of Ido. These are both part of his 15-book cycle of novels called the Ido Chronicles. Dr. Edwards lives in Quebec City and has published smaller pieces in both English and French. He is also a manuscript manuscript under preparation that deals with the Second World War, and during his off time, he is a fashion designer. His pronouns are he, they, and you can look him up at geoffreyjenedwards.com. So, welcome, Geoffreyjen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. 5,000 miles or whatever to come here. So I'm going to talk about the Ido Chronicles, which is this 15-book science fiction series that I'm in the process of developing. It takes place in the far future. Humans use molecular technologies to enhance their bodies in diverse ways. So, for instance, they can live and function directly in the vacuum because they have very thin membranes that protect their bodies and different mechanisms to breathe and so forth. One of the ways their bodies have been changed is to develop multiple sexual identities. So there are 7 sexual identities, what we tend to call genders, but in this case is sexual because it's biological and not just the social elements of it. And they're called, the different sexualities are called do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. Do is male, fa is female, and then there are different variations and mixes. Now, the gender aspect is rooted in my life. I'm now called Geoffreyjen Edwards. Jen is short for Jennifer, so the name includes my masculine and my feminine self as a gender fluid person. They also use a technology to slow time called tempo at the quantum level. The reason for this is they can move around the galaxy and not leave behind people who will age because they don't use faster than light travel. I'm a physicist and I don't believe in faster than light travel, so my books don't have it. No warp drive. And I use this tempo to slow time down, which does something similar. Civilization is divided into 5 groups or factions. Deofax, Idofax, Engfax, Ecofax, and Umafax. Deo are the mysticists. Ido, well, I'll come back to that in a moment. Engfax are the scientists and the engineers. Ecofacts are the ecologists. Umafacts are the artists. And Idofacts is an odd kind of group that is fascinated by paradox. And each of them has their own color and their own sigil. And these are found on the books as they're being published. They will each have their appropriate sigil. So there are 5 trilogies, one for each faction: the books of Deo, the books of Ido, the books of Eng, the books of Eco, and the books of Uma. The sigils were designed by a friend of mine, Ernesto Morales. But all the other drawings that you will see the one that was on the poster, these are my drawings. And I used the drawings as a way to sort of help illustrate the concepts that are in my books. It's kind of a way. I spent the day drawing because it was a way to relax myself instead of getting all enervated about the presentation tonight. So this one shows a space station in orbit above a sun, and there's a tube that runs down into the sun because these people modified the structure of stars by actually going down inside the stars. And that's the job of this community that this character grows up in. The Chronicles as a whole portrays a crisis during which humanity shifts towards a kind of sharing with other species at a kind of radical opening towards otherness. And it sits on a situation where there's a massive destructive event, and then it opens up in this way. So it's sort of the period just before the world becomes too difficult to describe. It's the last stage in humanity's development before that. I'm going to be reading from 3 of the trilogies. The first book of Deo, Plenum, which was published in April 2022, April last year. Messioph, the first book of Ido, which will be published in November, December this year. And Pinnacle, the first book of Eng, which is the next one lined up for next year. So, first of all, Plenum, the book that's published. Vanu is a gender-neutral novice in a religious community called the Kinship of the Suffering God, which is reworking the structure of stars inside the nebulas in this way, inside a stellar nursery to support a star-spanning communications technology that all of humanity has in operation. Vanu is neutral gendered, and I use pronouns she and here to talk about Vanu. The book ultimately is about, the book Plenum is a kind of study of bullying. Bullying at the level of children, but bullying also at the level of religious authorities that think they can set out what happens to people. And the animals play a role in the book as kind of allies in faced with this situation of bullying. And so the excerpt deals with the animals. Later, she went outside to look for Jetsu. Out here, the world was simpler. Oh, I think that I turned that off. Out here, the world was simpler. The Augies were clustered on the opposite side of the space platform from the docks. Here, the dramatic colors of the Plenum Nebula were largely hidden by the bulk of the platform. Vanu watched the Ogies for a while. They were nestled into a small hollow on the edge of the aft wall of the annex, rimmed by a wide, raised lip upon which grew the ubiquitous greenback that bedecked the hull. The presence of greenback here suggested there might be a small leakage of gas from inside the annex, or of water vapor from the reservoirs just inside the platform's skin. The greenback stripped oxygen from the gas molecules and stored it in small bladder-like fruits that clustered on the platform's outer surfaces. The oxygen the Ogies harvested from the bladders, combined with the carbon they digested from the barnax that also clung to the outer hull, generated the carbon dioxide the Ogies used to jet about the station. Like Vanu herself, Jetsu was at the transition between being considered a child and an adult. He could be found often enough playing with the younger Ogies, but more and more he held back with the adults. The latter were far more playful, however, than adult humans. Right now, the whole family was engaged in a game of throw and catch, with the adults doing the throwing and catching while the young were being flung around. It was a game, but a game with a purpose. The young Ogies were learning to extend and contract their tentacles in mid-flight and to use these to grasp hold of the adult Ogies without having to preoccupy themselves with issues of propulsion. Vanu enjoyed watching them immensely. It was so much more visceral a task than the kinds of things the kinship required of its members. And yet, visceral could be deeply spiritual if you gave it the time and the presence it really demanded. Jetsu, visible both because of his intermediate size and the distinct markings on his hide, didn't seem to know whether to stick with the throwing and catching or to allow himself to be hurled. The effort involved in throwing him was obviously more than for the smaller, younger Ogies, but none of the adults balked at doing so or seemed to censor him in any way, and the sheer enjoyment he displayed at being thrown was equal to that of any of the younger Ogies. Vanu envied him his dual status. Eventually the game wore itself out and the younger Ogies drifted away in small groups. Jetsu didn't join them. At this point, he obviously felt excluded. Vanu chose this moment to approach and hail him. "Hey, Jets, enjoying yourself?" "Vanu!" the Ogie replied excitedly. "You stay away from Jets. Lonely." The Ogie's manner of communicating was only partially rendered. Ogies tended to swallow the vowels, and syntax was very basic, but they were nonetheless able to communicate feelings quite well. "Went Starway a while," Vanu replied. "I'm back now to stay." "Vanu not go Starway again?" Vanu shook her head. The Ogie anchored himself to a jutting set of bars. "One show, Vanu. Look Starways." Vanu didn't understand what the Ogie was trying to tell her for a moment. Then, as she turned her gaze outward, away from the annex, she could see a moderately large shape looming quickly towards them. "What?" The form slowed and turned, and a startled Vanu realized this was a Jonah. Another of the ancient deep-sea creatures of old Earth that had been adapted to function in the spaces between the stars. Just as the Ogies were adapted from a cephalopod species, and the barnax were said to be similarly derived from sea creatures, the Jonahs were once a creature called a whale. Like their Ogie cousins, the Jonahs were equipped with a limited form of binap, allowing them to communicate with humans and to modify tempo. The magnificent creature drifted delicately up to the platform. "This my friend Tihal," Jetsu informed Vanu. "Tihal family near?" An image appeared in Vanu's bin-up showing the relationship between the annex and a nearby molecular cloud, rich in organics. Although the Jonah had a rudimentary bin-up, it didn't use language in the same literal way as did the Ojis. Instead, it communicated by images and feelings. "Tihal, good friend," Jetsu commented. "Tihal, this my friend, Vanu." A warm feeling of delight washed over Vanu. "I'm delighted to meet you too, Tihal." A sensation of urgency and haste passed over Vanu, followed by a feeling of regret, tinged with pleasure. This was further combined with the image of Jetsu and Vanu where they were currently located against the backdrop of the annex. "Can't stay," Jetsu replied. "Understand. Quick visit this time." The Jonah sailed away, disappearing rapidly into the distance. That's the first excerpt, just to give you a flavor of Plenum. The second is from Messioph, the first book of Ido. Different book, but the subject is also about the Jonahs. We are now located, I think, at the edge of a globular cluster where rival nomadic clans are competing for contract work to restructure the stars in a way similar to what was going on in Plenum. Grolier, the protagonist in this case, is male, though gendered. This story is also in some sense autobiographical, since it addresses the problem of abuse. Just like the first one deals with bullying, I was a victim of bullying, this one deals with sexual abuse, and I had some of that in my past as well. Like Plenum, it is not what I set out. Like Plenum, the book isn't necessarily what I set out to write. I ended up writing a different book than I expected to. But books are often like that. Also, I think abuse is one of the issues of our time. At one point, one of the historians in the book suggests that all history can be explained in terms of the abuse of individuals. Here, the abuse extends to the Jonahs, who become emblematic of its effects and ultimately affect the resolution of the novel in the way that it deals with abuse. The dreams had persisted for months, but had finally started to settle down. They still unnerved him. They set a tone of disharmony, even though his life had been going so much better. He had started to think about tracking down Yetchen, the Jonah he was convinced was the source of these sendings, the one who had carried him and his brother just before their holding was destroyed. So when he was brought the news, he was thrilled. The Jonahs want to talk to you. In the days of the old holding, they had had 2 or 3 Jonahs within easy reach, but since the destruction of their home, they had relied on our ships and still had no explicit plans for re-engaging with the Jonahs. Maybe it was a good moment to change that. The Jonahs lived together in herds when they weren't in transit. Although they were a social species, most of those Grolier had known were content to spend long periods away when called upon to do so. The herds grazed the dust shoals around the edges of the Messioph cluster. There was a series of shoals leeward of the new holding, and Grolier would likely find the herd there. He took a small R-ship, barely large enough to turn around in. He thought about taking someone else along, but decided against it. The invitation had been, as far as he could discern, for himself alone. At a tempo of 200, the trip would take 2 days each way, but of course, at higher tempo values, subjective time, it would go a lot faster. Did he know why he was so set on going? The Jonahs intrigued him, but he didn't know how to respond to them. Maybe this encounter would help. It seemed a small price to pay for what might be an important exchange. It was the first time he had been truly alone since his venture into the debris field, and on that occasion he had been preoccupied with other matters. He did, however, take out the sparring stick from his pocket. The ship was not really large enough to permit a proper workout, but that was partly why he wanted to try. The stick used creatively could allow him to stretch his muscles in interesting ways, even in a cramped space. He shook it so that it extended to its full length and disentangled himself from the netting that held him. After 2 hours of tugging, swiveling, vaulting, twisting, gliding, he collapsed the stick and carefully put it back into its pocket. He was exhausted, a happy state, as that dulled the other feelings as well. He slept, a dreamless state this time, a moment of calm before bigger things. Over the course of the second day, he undertook 2 more training sessions with the stick. He took time also to gaze at the starscape, downwards towards the cluster center, and outwards looking at the distant disk of the galaxy with its whorls of light and dark. Finally, the dark bands between him and the cluster center came into view. These were the shoals. He sent a query ahead, but there was no answer, so he maintained course. As he came closer, his ship's sensors picked up a faint murmur. He had to come almost into their midst before they recognized his presence. Groliedizius came the word image. He acknowledged the greeting. "You want to talk to me?" he suggested. He received an image that showed him leaving his ship. "Talk easier," came the halting suggestion. That was interesting, Grolier thought. Talking with the Jonahs required the bin-up. How would being in physical contact with them help? However, now wasn't the moment to question their motives. Jonahs had never harmed any human. So he exited the ship, using his opaque jets to spurt towards the nearest of the creatures. This was one of the largest Jonahs he had ever encountered. It was over 50 meters long. He hadn't known that such large Jonahs even existed. Maybe, he ruefully reflected, there was a lot humans didn't know about Jonahs. "What shall I call you?" he asked as he reached the flank of the creature. He reached out to touch it with his hand. "Moses," came the unexpected reply, and it wasn't broken up into syllables the way the speech had been earlier. "Moses, such an auspicious name," he broadcast, wondering if the Jonah would understand him. Immediately a flood of images assailed him, among them words, sentences, entire discourses. He picked out excerpts from the Old Testament. The creature was quoting the Bible at him. Something about a covenant. This suggested, no, it revealed that the creature understood perfectly the significance of the human name for its kind, Jonahs, as well as the resonances that went with the name of Moses. But the information sent also included querying in relation to recent events, the destruction of the Decius holding and the banishing of the Tragan and Anbach clans, and a sense of uncertainty. "You wish to know, I'm trying to decipher your message. What role, what part will be asked of the Jonahs in the war between our peoples?" Assent. Was it a war then? He hadn't thought about the events in those terms. Wasn't it over, though, if there had been a war? However, he knew in his belly it wasn't, and he couldn't hide those feelings from this highly observant being. So be it, he thought. It was a war, and ongoing. So what about the Jonah's queries? It was a legitimate question. You've been in touch with the Tragans then. He wanted confirmation, something. More images. Was that an openness to exchange and some kind of a promise made to the Tragans? So it was looking for a similar response from Decius. He needed to be careful and not propose anything he couldn't deliver. I don't rightly know how to keep you out of the conflict, was his honest reply, although he knew how inadequate it sounded. The way Jonahs were treated generally, nobody would be thinking about their welfare much. Under normal circumstances, they could protect themselves, but during a war, he returned to those other questions that had troubled him. Why come to him, and why now? What did they know that he didn't? He tried again. I don't know, but I will do my best to make sure your situation is at least addressed. I will talk to the other clans about this. I don't know what else I can do. Gratitude. Gratitude? Even now, the creature was giving him, and humans in general, the benefit of the doubt. We hardly deserve their service on our behalf, Grolier found himself thinking. May I ask you a question, he ventured. Assent, but with a touch of puzzlement. Your species has partnered with humans for such a long time, and we haven't always treated you as well as we should. Why do you stay? The answer was long and complex, even more so than the earlier communication. Images and feelings, words and pre-words, but also what he realized were memories. Did Moses actually remember swimming in old Earth's oceans? Did these creatures have some kind of species memory? Or were these images merely imaginative projections? What Grolier understood was that there was a principle of long association, an openness to new experiences, and a clear sense of partnership, of both giving and receiving, and a formal arrangement, the covenant to which it had referred earlier. But the nature of this agreement remained unclear to Grolier. He decided to be blunt. I'm sorry, but I didn't fully understand your reply. Clearly, you get something back from the association, as a species, I mean, and not only access to new experiences. Something about how interstellar space is organized, about the music it generates. And you've mentioned this covenant a couple of times. I never heard of such a thing. What can you tell me about it? Your people have forgotten much, came the reply, spoken in its broken English without the flood of images this time. Am Moses for good reason. Read your history. There was more here than he knew how to process, the reference to Moses. Hadn't he been the one to deliver the 10 Commandments? If what the Jonah was suggesting was corrected, there existed, or there should exist, a record of this mysterious agreement. A final question, he said. It was complicated to say, so he used his undertale to send a complex feeling image of his dreams about Jonah's songs. Moses was silent for a long interval. Grolier waited. Perhaps he should have said nothing. Then he experienced something unexpected. Instead of just receiving another image, he found himself inside the Jonah's sensorium, its perceptions. And instead of the one voice he might have expected to find, he was surrounded by thousands in layers that seemed to crisscross both space and time. The sadness he had experienced in his dreams was there, but it was braided in with many other feeling states, joy, wonder, and awe, cut through with dismay and disruption and splashes of pain and fear. Also, they were all singing a deep, humming, wordless mix of harmonies and dissonances. He found his awareness being guided until he settled on one voice. It was Yetchen. There was a moment of mutual recognition and indeed of happiness. The Jonah was pleased to reconnect. The other voices faded into the background, and Grolier received a kind of apology. Oceanic songs can overwhelm humans. The message didn't arrive in words, but that was the gist of what was said. This was followed by another instance of the multiplexed voices and a sensation of a link being turned off. Then he was left alone with his thoughts. So the third, there's a pair of excerpts, are taken from the third, from the books of Eng. And it's a very different context. Pinnacle, so this is, okay. Pinnacle, unlike the two previous cited novels, which were situated on space stations, takes place in a city floating high in the atmosphere of the planet Pinnacle. This is a sketch of the city. It concerns two characters, a young man, Oref, referred to here only as Wonder Boy, and a young woman, Reliana, the focus of the two excerpts. Reliana is undergoing a series of mysterious and massive bodily changes. Unbeknownst to her, she is in the process of becoming the progenitor of a new species. In the excerpts, we also hear her future self commenting on the transformation via poetry. This is also, in some sense, autobiographical, because my own gender fluid self has been emerging from me in the last several years, and it has some of the feeling of what you read here. It's not been an easy process. When I moved now, I could feel the other shapes within. These were much more feral than I was, more sensitive to changing sense and vibrational states in the air and the soil. And my movements were more precise. I wondered if other people noticed. I sometimes had to work hard to keep my elbows close to my body. They wanted to splay out. I was sure that showed. I also wondered if one could make a better guess towards what functional shape my body was reconfiguring itself. New eyes, 5 instead of 2. Changing leg morphology. The shape was different. Enhanced sensitivity to water, better smell and sound perception, vision that had shifted to a wider spectrum. What else was there? Enhanced strength. The changes in my legs and posture suggested modifications to my bone structure, but to what end? There seemed to be a clearly defined end state, but I still could not make out what it might be. You'd think Wonder Boy would have noticed, but he didn't seem to have done so. Of course, he knew about the aches and pains. I had told him often enough, especially in the early days. At first, he was concerned, but repetition seemed to dull his interest, and then he said nothing. I did talk about it less, not because the pain had diminished. On the contrary, it had become much more debilitating. But as the changes became apparent to me, I became more circumspect about sharing them. When the pain was too much, I stayed away from other people altogether, Wonder Boy included. I considered his lack of interest a good thing. There was a lesson there that was not lost on me either. The changes going on inside me might still be barely visible, but if or when that changed, public opprobrium would likely follow. I was not sure how to prepare for that. I didn't seem to have many allies. And then from the writing of the progenitor, the poet is still here, speaking in her multitudes and through third person, in these interlocked haikus, a form that reveals the paradox which has no fixed time or tense. She moves through the sentences, bringing the future to nest in each now, as much augure as echo, the atemporal serenity chasing chaotic transformation, the long view informs. And then a second excerpt from another chapter, focusing on her sensitivity to water. The issue of water had become more than a minor annoyance. Dry skin was one thing, desiccation another. My skin cells were flaking off in whole patches now, although the irritation was almost lost among the other sources of discomfort. I had greatly increased the presence of the water-bearing Nemo's plants. I had greatly increased the presence of the water-bearing Nemo plants, not just inside, but along the public pathways near to my parents' home. I would drag myself out and spend an hour soaking up the moisture in the Nemo patches I had coaxed into growing where none would normally be found. Then back into the pard, which had become unduly hot. I was convinced this was more psychological than real, as the sensors told me a different story. Why did I feel so feverish then? Also, there had been considerable blood loss. When I awoke in the morning, more often than not, I was sharing my sleep pad with bubbles of blood. At first I panicked. I assumed my body was beginning to disintegrate. But I actually felt better, not worse, each time this happened. I knew my body was able to generate new blood, so blood loss wasn't on its own was not necessarily a problem. But the issue persisted, and over time the answers didn't seem to matter if the result was a better, stronger me. I needed to find somewhere more suitable to live, I realized. I knew of several locations where atmospheric moisture was high, especially near the bottom parts of the city where the mist collected. And those spaces would be cooler than usual as well. And I also needed a place where blood wouldn't pool. There was one location I had in mind, 2 levels up from the bottom cones, a wide, flat pan with woody plants and spiner tubes that formed into chaotic horizontal layers filled with leaves and transparencies where the light found its way in. Not a space for humans, since one had to squeeze oneself in, but ideal for my current situation. And from the writings of the progenitor once more, bodily fluids, reinventing the status quo as she struggles to establish new equilibria, new flows, new spaces of rest. The numinous spreads into the interstices of her becoming. Between the current self and future descendants, animal ghost gods play with the foreground. Oracles, indeed, woven into systems of time. Thank you.
Hi, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to Marco, Heather, and Geoffreyjen for presenting. Oh yes, the Q&A, I'm so sorry.
What I will say is this, is that tomorrow night, Geoffreyjen will be leaving on Thursday, so we're planning to go out to a place called Outworld Brewing. It's on Route 119, halfway between 3rd Avenue and Route 25, Interstate 25. So if anybody's interested in that, just to hang out, get to talk a little bit more. If you're curious about Cosmos Cooperative or about Untimely Books, we'll be there and can answer your questions or just chat. So let us know afterwards if you'd like to do that. We're going to be going anyway. And then as for tonight, I don't know. We might go out and have a beverage or something. So hang out if you'd like to do that with us. I think, I suppose around dinner time. Let's say around 6-ish, around 6:30. Excuse me? Tomorrow, Wednesday. Yeah. Okay, so are we good with the chairs here? Do we need to move them back a little bit? Okay. All right, great. So this will be our mic. It could just be feed, just if you want to say something. Yeah.
It's a good question. I mean, I'm a physicist, so I tend to struggle with those questions all the time, and I had to think very hard about how one might actually do this. And it's probably a stretch, let's admit that. But it's several thousand years in our future. Humans are pretty inventive. We can come up with ways to do things that today look almost impossible. I've imagined a set of technologies that would allow this. Molecular scale machines essentially moving through the inside of the body in the system when they're working in interstellar space. There was a film a few years ago called Abyss about the deep sea, and in it you saw a technology which consisted of collapsing the lungs and filling it with liquid. And it's used today in certain contexts. And so I imagine something like that to replace the standard breathing. My membranes are equipped with pores that feed oxygen in through the skin rather than through breathing. And so the and there's a system for either carrying oxygen in compressed form in pockets throughout the membrane, but inside the space stations, there are little bubbles that propagate and carry oxygen and carbon dioxide to and from individuals. So there's an infrastructure to allow these membranes to operate. But it's massive re-engineering of the human body in order to support this kind of thing. I wanted to work that out, what might be possible. I'm also interested in how it changes what it means to be human, to have those kinds of technologies that are, because that's what we do as humans. We invent technologies and then they change us. And understanding those changes as they come into our, and it's all connected to the body. The changes have to do with the different ways that we instrument our bodies. And so this kind of extreme engineering that I've introduced in my books is a way of exploring those consequences in terms of what happens. And indeed, the shift that I spoke about of humanity towards something that is radically other follows from this fact of having re-engineered the body. Yeah, I think I mean, they're good questions, and clearly we're all preoccupied with abuse.
We don't want to abuse your time. So we've been here for a couple hours now, and I think our time is done. Let's 1 more minute. So this is the last call. Let's say, Caroline.
have an answer. I think partly what unifies us is a focus on the very personal and the very global. It's the mix of those two things that brings us all together. So squirreling in as deep as one can go into the personal, but keeping in view the global. I think you see it in all of our work.
I would add to that, and I completely concur, and I think this goes along with that, is a willingness to to stay open, to not collapse into a pre-given narrative or into an answer, but to keep a question alive and to keep a relationship with the mystery of being, with the mystery of who we are, what's going on, to keep that alive and to channel that into our work. I think that's something that everyone who I've worked with in the context of Cosmos carries a spark of and manifests it in very different ways, because that's the nature of the mystery, is inexhaustible diversity and inexhaustible creativity. So that's what I feel is kind of at the essence of Cosmos.
Kind of hard to follow the Cosmos founder articulating a vision. That sounded really good, in other words. But I guess the piece I would add here is that we all have complex identities. We're many things, and we move amongst those things with each other in comfortable ways. And so, we have scientists, philosophers, poets, teachers of various forms, and people who are really dedicated to making these things and putting them out into the world to reach more people. So I would say, even the musical scales for gender, that's just an example of how those complex identities kind of crystallize into some of the work that we're doing.
Okay, well, I just really want to thank you for being here. This is everything I hoped it could be. So glad you showed up. We filled the room. We got our work out. You received it beautifully. And it's just been an honor to see all of your faces here tonight. And I know that we'll stay in touch. And again, the invitation is out. We'll be going out tomorrow night to Outworld Brewing. So if you want more information about that, just talk to me afterwards, 6 o'clock, I think, something like that. Don't hold me down to it, but more or less. And I think that's it. I got to thank Eric for the volunteer help with the cameras, Lindsay and Vince in the other room, and Kayla, who's been sitting outside, and Emily. There you are. Thank you so much. Really, we couldn't have done it without you.